here with Master Gunsmith Fred Zeglin, and we're going to do a rifle build like nothing you've seen on the channel before. Gavin here from UltimateReloader.com. Fred, thank you for coming to the Ultimate Reloader Ranch.
Thanks for inviting me. We're having a lot of fun.
Absolutely. We just completed a video you're going to want to check out talking about gunsmiths, eccentric personalities, tools at 40rentals.com that you can rent, books, and more. And we kind of set the stage for this story. We're going to do something different. Any of you that have been watching the channel know that I am kind of a meticulous person, and I've been known to use high-end gear, we'll say. This time, we're going to take things down a notch. We're going to do some procedures, and we're going to use some tools that are, I would say, more budget-friendly.
Correct.
And more accessible to gunsmiths with maybe a little bit less specialized knowledge, emerging, or just someone that wants to do a job in a more simple way.
Right. And I see a lot of guys that I think they start with these methods because you can do it maybe in the garage or from the kitchen table.
Yes.
Where otherwise you'd have to go out and buy a lot of equipment.
Yes. I am very much looking forward to watching you run my lathe and watching you do things differently, because I think there's more than one way to skin a cat, and it really all depends on what you have at your disposal and what your goals are ultimately. So, lay it out for us. What kind of a build are we going to do here? What do we have to start with?
So we have a Ruger American in 350 Legend, and I picked this up specifically to do this build. And we talked about what can you do with this, what different calibers, and we talked about 277 Wolverine, which maybe is very appropriate these days, you know. Wolverine!
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So, but anyway, that was an option. We talked about 300 Ham R, which is a longer version kind of the 300 Blackout. And ultimately, we just came back to the straight 300 AAC Blackout.
Yeah.
And feeds great from the same magazine.
Yep.
And one of the things I found with the gun is the factory magazine for the 350 Legend doesn't feed as smooth as I would like. And that's a combination of the magazine and how the gun was breached. So we'll talk about that a little when we take the gun apart.
Orange follower, 350 Legend, black follower, regular old 223 556.
Right. And we both tried the 223 type magazine in there, and it just changes the gun completely.
Oh yeah.
Much smoother feeding and probably be a lot more pleasant to shoot in general.
Yep. So those of you that aren't familiar with the 350 Legend, it's built around an AR-15 compatible cartridge design, so 2.260 or less cartridge overall length. So this rifle has the 223 bolt face. This is a great platform to do this kind of build. We could do it 223.
Yes.
We could do any of those 223 case room variants as long as they fit those criteria.
Right. Just have to fit your magazine length is the only issue.
Yep. Have not done a Ruger American build, and this is interesting because this action is a little bit different. This is a 3-lug design. We've got a barrel nut, and we've got a different type of interface between the receiver itself and the stock.
Right.
Best of all, they're really affordable. I know a lot of you shoot them. We did the Go Wild 65 Creedmoor review. That was really, really popular. I know a lot of you really liked that story. It ended up with a Monstrum scope, and we've got a Monstrum scope here. So I think things tend to come around full circle.
Right. And you know, the thought process in part when I was looking for a gun was I wanted something that fit this size range. And we weren't really sure in the beginning what that caliber would be, but I wanted something in that size range. And one of the advantages to this choice is I have a suppressor. So we're going to go ahead and thread the muzzle and set it up for suppressor so that we can do that. The gun overall is interesting to me because I get questions from people frequently about how can I work on these less expensive guns? What's the value? Is it worth doing? And so I really wanted to do this build in part so that I can have a better feeling for this particular gun. I mean, I've worked with Savages, I've worked with just about anything you can think of. Sure. But the Ruger American is new for me as a gunsmith. So it was fun to take it apart, take it out of the stock, and look at how things engage. The recoil system, as recoil lugs as we would normally call them, is completely different. And we should show that on camera.
Definitely.
Fun stuff. I mean, to work with a new gun and a new style. The thing that's interesting to me is everything that I've ever been taught about guns, it's just a different method, just a different thought process went into this design.
Yeah.
So it's fun to look at that and see what the engineer had in mind and maybe whether that works or not.
Definitely.
Right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to crack this barrel. We're going to take the barrel off, take some measurements. We're going to go over to the lathe, take this barrel blank, and work on the chambering end. We're going to get it back out of the lathe. We're going to use the annular cutter and a die for 5/8 24. This is going to be something I've never shown, which is threading a muzzle without a lathe.
Right.
I might just have to look the other way.
Yeah,
and it's inner OCD in me with my white lab coat on. I mean, but this is what it's about. This is about showing different ways.
Right, and the reason that I ended up with annular cutters, it wasn't my idea. Other people thought this up. Was customers were coming to me and saying, you know, I don't have a lathe, but I want to work the muzzle of my gun. I want to put a muzzle flash hider, muzzle brake, suppressor, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And so they kind of pushed that on me. It was something that, as the head of the company, hadn't thought of yet. So sometimes the client is the source of new information.
Yeah.
So I started carrying them, and they turned out to be very, very popular. There's a lot of people who want to do this kind of work that just don't have a lathe.
Yep. So, and if you click on that first link in the video description, there's going to be links to the tooling that we're using in that full article that I always publish to accompany this video. Okay, so Fred and I are going to go over to the lathe. We're going to get this going. We're going to probably encounter some unknown issues, and we will provide regular checkups at each stage of the process throughout this entire build. Let's get going.
All right.
Well, there we go. The barreled action is done.
Yes, sir. The only thing left to do really would be to polish where we turned the shank a little bit.
Oh, yes.
Other than that, it's ready to rock and roll.
And speaking of the job, the barreling job, we were using the Precision Matthews PM 1440 GT, and this was your first time using that specific machine.
Right.
What did you think?
You know, anytime you walk into another guy's shop and you have to use their machine, it's a little difficult sometimes, but very quickly it became comfortable, and the machine is great. It runs smooth. The cuts were beautiful, and that's a sign of a good machine when you can step up and the very first work you do comes out really nice.
Yep.
So I'm seriously thinking maybe it's time for me to trade up.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we walk through the process? And this was fun. It was fun for me to just give you the reins and watch the way that you do a build like this.
Right. Yeah, in fact, you told me more than once, this is your show, let's get it going, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So put me to work.
You're the cook, and this is the kitchen.
Right, right. And the idea behind these kinds of builds was to show that you don't have to invest a fortune in really cool tools. All those cool tools are fun, and they make the job easier and maybe better quality, and there's a lot of reason to do that. But there's a lot of guys starting out in gunsmithing who don't have the nest egg to invest in that kind of tooling. So the point is to show that you can build really good quality hunting guns without spending a fortune.
Yeah.
That you could take Grandpa's old lathe and set up and do this same exact work. So I really like the process. It's fast. I mean, we haven't been working all that long, and we're completely finished. So
yeah.
The things that we take into account that you would do in a more precise job is lots of measurements of the action itself to make sure that we get proper headspace and we have a gap between the face of the bolt and the back of the barrel so we don't have any interference there.
Yep.
Try to make sure that everything is really well aligned, even though we're using a less accurate system. By facing the back of the barrel, that gives us a nice perpendicular situation on the bore. And that little bit of variance that might be there, if you think about the angular problem that we're looking at, the deflection is so small that's why you can get away with it.
Yep.
One thing you could do that would be a little bit more accurate in this system would be to use a 60-degree cutter and bevel the back of the barrel. If you do that, you just have to take into consideration how big is my chamber going to be so you don't overcut.
Yep.
But that gives you a better seat on the tailstock.
Right. And so before we even went to the lathe, we took the takeoff barrel. We loosened the nut, took the barrel off, and made kind of the typical cheat sheet, the tenon print, if you want to think of it that way, for reference dimensions, and the go gauge to get our protrusion.
Yeah, and in this case, I forgot to bring 300 legend stuff, so we couldn't measure directly.
350 legend.
Right. Yep, 350. My
or did
apologies.
you just invent a new cartridge?
I probably did, but that's called the 300 Ham R, I think.
Well, that's right.
But yes, but basically,
which is ironic. The guy with thousands of tools has them all at his shop, and it's not with him.
Right. It's kind of crazy, isn't it?
It is, but we totally made do.
Yeah, well, all we did was we took a case and used that for measurement. And what we were after in this case, since it has, we reused the nut, so we're setting headspace with the nut like on a Savage or, in this case, Ruger American. You have some adjustability there. So in those systems, the factories have figured out we just headspace to a certain depth. And so that's what we were looking for, is what does the factory set it to? They set it to about 130 thousandths, meaning that the go gauge is protruding about 130 thousandths out of the back of the barrel. So that makes it very easy for us to headspace on the lathe, because you don't even have to bring the action over and test it.
Yep.
You just cut until the headspace gauge is at 130, and then when you go to assemble everything, you use the barrel and the nut and the action to make all those settings.
And the cheat sheet, it takes you out of the moment, right? You've written it down in advance. You've got a diagram so you can see which measurement is which dimension is which, and then when you're operating the lathe, you don't have to second guess yourself. You know, this is what I need. You can refer back to it.
And we measured more than one time, and I made a mistake in one of my measurements, which was one of the reasons we measured again, but I always measure at least twice.
Yes.
Because there's always the chance that you're going to have a chip someplace that's interfering, or some dirt or whatever. I always clean all the parts, take the measurements 2 or 3 times.
Sometimes I like to use 2 different tools. Like you can use digital calipers to do a depth measurement as just a rough check, right?
Right.
And then you can use your depth micrometer as the precise check, and then you know you should be in the same range, and then you probably trust your depth micrometer for that really precise measurement.
Correct.
But the other one is just kind of like, I'm not 1 revolution off in my, reading of the tool or whatever.
Which is easy to do if you're, And of course, being in a filming situation, I was a little more stressed than I would be normally, so I misread a dial, and that's what happens.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed this build because it was something I hadn't done before as far as this particular model.
Yep. Me either.
Yeah, and we got an opportunity to use some of the more manual type tools to do our muzzle threading and do that cut. So that's a demonstration of how a guy can do this kind of work without a lathe.
Now, before we get to that, why don't we do a step-by-step walkthrough of the actual barrel work on the lathe?
Okay.
Because this is totally different than the way that I've demonstrated it again and again here on the channel. So we have the true bore alignment system, and we specifically, I dialed it so that the chuck jaws were just running perfectly true, as if the 6-jaw chuck were mounted directly on a D1 5 mount. Right. And that was our starting point. And I'll let you take over describing from there.
So what we did at that point was, now we knew that the chuck was completely aligned, and the bore was going to be aligned to it. So we set it up and faced off the back of the barrel, which gives us a clean square surface to the bore, and it eliminates any damage that has been done in either the turning process or the manufacturing process, so that we're square and flat.
Yep.
That's where you could run your 60-degree cutter in the back to make it seat better on the center.
Yeah.
Then we extended the barrel out, and I put a little bit of a shim on the barrel to protect it from damage, held it in the 6-jaw so that it's extended out over the bed, and then placed the tailstock in place and use a center to hold on the bore.
Yep. Here we're using a live center, so it has ball bearings inside, and basically the center goes into the muzzle,
in the breech
end in this particular case, and it spins with the barrel material, so you don't have any friction.
Right. Prevents you from burning up the steel and maybe wearing off a bunch of material.
Yep.
I'll just take a little sideline there. When I was in high school, I took a machine shop class, and the guy who taught the class was named Mr. Kuhn, and he had what he called Kuhn's elixir. And when he used a dead center, he'd put Kuhn's elixir on it, and it was a mix of stuff that he wouldn't tell us what it was.
Yep, of course.
And that was his magic. And he was funny about it, because he'd say, every machinist has their own elixir.
Right.
Yep. So, but that was always, I always remember that whenever I use a live center, I think of him.
Nice.
No
elixir needed.
Right. And you're not doing any damage. So even with Kuhn's elixir, there was always a flat spot left when you were done.
Yep.
So, but so once we were set up on the center, at that point we did our tenon turning. So we reduced the diameter to where we're going to thread. We cut a recess at the end of right next to the shoulder, so that we have a place for the threads to end.
And that was 1 inch 16 threads.
Yes,
for
1
the
inch,
motor? Yep.
1 inch 16, which is interesting because that's the same as several other guns. And so there's a lot of tooling that you could have in your shop that would cross over.
Smart move.
Yeah, and I think it turned out good for us.
Ruger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's the same as like Winchester and I don't remember who else. There's 2 or 3 of them that have Ruger 77, which is another one of their models.
Okay.
So that makes sense
Yep.
that they would repeat that.
Inch and a 16th is another popular diameter. 16 threads per factory rifles and 18 for customs. And
Right, right. So once we had our our tenon set up properly with that relief cut, just threaded the tenon. We used initially we used the barrel nut as the test to see how our threads were going. And then when we got close, I switched to the receiver because it's far more important that the receiver fit well. The barrel nut is simply to set our headspace and lock it in place.
Yep.
So the nut doesn't really do anything for you in terms of keeping things aligned.
Right.
Right.
And the receiver has a longer threaded section. So
Right. Quite a bit longer, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one nice thing about this action. I think why it has a tendency to be accurate is it probably has a couple more threads than a lot of
Interesting.
a lot of factory guns. It's not a lot, but enough that I think you get a little bit more protection in terms of keeping it aligned.
Yep.
It feels really smooth. The bolt goes in nice and smooth. You know.
Yep.
So.
And one note on that threading was we were going to use an indexable tool. We tried 2 different ones, and because of the live center and the edge of the tenon, we didn't have enough room there, so we used a carbide with brazed on carbide steel shank tool, and that worked fine.
Right, and that's one of those things that you have to realize when you go from model to model, you may run into issues like that where you have to switch out tooling. Yep. And I sometimes hear young gunsmiths going, well, now I have to break down my setup. We're talking about 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Right.
You know, just do what you need to do.
And if you're getting started with machine work and gunsmithing, I like to have sets of tools. I was looking for my 1/4 inch Shank 60-degree threading tool. Couldn't find it. If we had found it, that would have been the best.
Sure, would have fit right in.
A great little project is to take whatever shank size you have for your tool holder and mill out a pocket for a 1/4 inch tool, and then your 2 screws holds it, right down in there, and then you can even have the same top distance and not have to raise and lower it too much. And all that. But I couldn't find it, so we used what was a 1/2 inch shank tool or something like that.
Right. So. Did our threading, did a test fit with the nut, eventually went to the receiver and got it to where it was a nice fit where it's there's no play side to side, but it threads up nice and close. And it actually gets just a little tighter at the end, which is nice because then you're tightening up on the threads a little bit and you're eliminating any possible movement. So that I like that kind of fit when I do a barrel. I like them to get just a little snugger, and it's really kind of by accident, I mean, I suppose what's happening is there's a little bit of flex. When you make that initial cut, it's taking a little more material off, and as it gets further back, then it doesn't get quite as much. But,
right.
So once that was done, we did face the back of the barrel off again. And the reason we did that is I overshot the headspace by 12 thousandths. And because our shank is really long and we're using a nut, that didn't create any problems. We didn't have to bump the shoulder or anything.
Yep. And that was after the chambering, right? You were talking about when you were done. Let's tell me about the chambering for a moment.
So chambering is very different from the Gordy method and whatnot. So we leave the barrel, we've threaded it or turned it, threaded it, and got everything prepped in this setup where it's on the center. So the final thing we do there is we do a skim cut on the shank of the barrel here.
Yep.
And what that does is it makes the outer diameter of the barrel concentric to the bore as best it can be.
Right.
And that's for this method. If you did this with Gordy's method, it wouldn't get you anywhere near close enough.
Right, where you're dialing to inside of the bore, on the grooves. Yeah.
Right, and I'm a fan of Gordy's method. I use it, but this is for lower cost, a little easier to do.
I think I hear Gordy calling, but I'm going to let it go to voicemail.
Okay, fair enough. He probably heard me talking about him.
That's right.
Ears are burning. I get it. So once we got that skim cut, then that's when you change the setup.
Yeah.
And so then we break down the tailstock and everything. We move the barrel into the 6-jaw chuck. A 3-jaw would be okay if that's what you had.
Yep.
Oftentimes I'll put painter's tape or something on the barrel to eliminate doing any damage marking from the chuck. We didn't need to do that because we had just turned the Skim Cut. So,
the
anyway,
6-shot is good for that. It has so many contact points that it tends to be pretty good about.
They almost never leave a mark.
Yeah, I like it.
And 6-jaws are awesome because once they're dialed in, you know, you pretty well count on them being the same.
Yeah. Or thin-walled material, holding onto screw threads. Yeah, a lot of good uses for that.
Right. So grabbed it there. Now we know that we're concentric on the bore and everything is aligned. The cheat that we use is we use the Manson reamer holder.
Yep, the floater.
Right. And so what that does is it just allows the reamer to follow that hole. So if for any reason, and there probably is from manufacturing, the barrel's not perfectly straight, that will take up any error. So if you have an inexpensive machine or an old machine that's got some wear.
A tailstock that's not perfectly at the right height would be a common thing.
Most guys know that they have to align their tailstock in windage.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. Yep.
But they're not aware that when they tighten that thing down, of course they've seen your stuff about Gordy, they know that there's a torque there and things change.
Yeah.
But you'd be surprised how many people just take for granted that tailstock is solid.
Some tailstocks leave the factory high so that as things wear in, they lower down to,
And if you think about that, when you're turning, that doesn't hurt anything.
Sure.
Because you're cutting here on the side.
Right.
So if there's a little bit of a taper this way, that's not actually going to affect how the lathe cuts.
Right.
But when you're chambering, that's a different deal because now you're off axis.
Right. It'd be like precision drilling where you might run into some slight issues there or reaming,
Right. So it's just a shortcoming in the functionality of how lathes are designed and made. And it's not a shortcoming as a lathe, it's a shortcoming as a gunsmithing tool.
Sure, yeah.
So just being aware of that, the floating reamer holder solves that problem.
Yep.
And I've heard machinists say, why would you use a floating reamer holder? You're allowing the tool to wander. And when you explain to them what it does and what its purpose is, they almost universally say, oh, well, that makes complete sense.
It's just like a reloading press. We have several reloading presses that allow float, either the die or the shell holder or both. And that gets you very, very, very close. And we're building a hunting rifle, right? And then there's where you want to force everything into perfect alignment, which is not necessary for this particular scenario. And it gives you more leeway with your equipment and tooling, right?
Right. It's faster. It's easier. And that's why I said earlier, you know, if you do the bench rest method and you do all of the chasing every detail to get the best accuracy, you need to charge for that work.
Yeah.
And conversely, when I do this work for somebody, it allows me to be more friendly to their budget. And not because I'm giving away my work, but because they can't afford to go that extra mile.
Yep.
But I'm still giving them a sub-minute of angle gun that is going to be more than adequate for hunting.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I always tell people, minute of deer is about 8 inches at 100 yard. So if you got a sub-minute of angle gun, it's entirely on you at that point.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
So
normally I pre-drill, normally you pre-drill, right, for larger diameter stuff, but this time there wasn't much of a difference between the 300 Blackout and the 30 cal. That's kind of an interesting pairing there.
Yeah, so we actually talked about whether to pre-drill or not and decided not to because there's so little material actually being removed that you wouldn't have sped things up much. In fact, the changing tooling might have taken more time.
True, and technically you never need to pre-drill. If you have enough time on your hands and enough patience, you could do a 300 PRC with a 30 cal bore and be just fine.
Yeah.
But there's no need.
Right. But I get this question sometimes, well, what kind of reamer do I need to do this?
Yeah.
Well, a finish reamer is a finish reamer is a finish reamer. You can order them with special features, but if you just call and order a SAMI spec reamer, it's going to have a throat, it's going to have a neck, it's going to have a shoulder, it's going to have a body, and all those dimensions are already built in.
Sure, yeah.
And the intention is that you can cut the entire chamber with it. If you want to rough the chamber, you can get roughing reamers, you can drill them out and then bore them so that they're aligned properly. But there's no reason why a guy can't cut the whole chamber with the reamer. And, and the reamer will last much longer than people think. If you're using good quality cutting oil and you're using care with the tool, in a one-man shop, a reamer should last 70 or 80 chambers easily without being resharpened. If it needs sharpened sooner, you're either
doing something wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting barrels that are extremely hard. There are some makers that purposely use harder materials, and that'll put more wear on the tool. But if they're using the standard 4140 and 416, there's no problem there.
Yep. It just goes to show the same point we've been making. There's more than one way to skin the cat. And it's really about getting to the destination the way that's going to be best for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I'm talking to students, I'll tell them, because they'll say, well, I read it in a book, I read it in a magazine. I say, look, there's probably 100 ways to do this. My guess is 70 of them will give you a good result. 30 of them will make a heck of a mess.
Right, right.
Because they were written by somebody who had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And so I encourage them to go ahead and experiment. When it comes to class time, a lot of times I'll hold them to a standard because there's only so much time in the day.
Sure, yeah.
But I do tell them, when you get out on your own, you should experiment. You should figure out what works best on your machine with the materials and tools you're using, the kind of cutting fluids you use or whatever.
Yep.
There are so many variables that go into machining and building guns that you got to find what works for you.
Yeah.
Just because I do a method and it works for me doesn't mean everybody will.
A lot of it has to do with thought process, right, and intuition.
Right.
So back to the chambering, tell us about the different levels of plunge that you do, cleaning and that kind of thing.
So the initial cut, I'm concerned about hitting the rifling with the throat of the reamer. If you were to jam in too quickly, the reamer's going to have to cut the rifling off all in one pass. Very hard on the reamer and not good for your setup because you're putting a lot of stress on everything.
Yeah.
So what I like to do is bring the tailstock up close. Because we're using the floating reamer holder, I just steady it so that the tip of the reamer goes into the bore nice and smooth.
Yep.
Lots of lube, of course. And then I lock down the tailstock and I start turning and watching and seeing when that cut starts.
Yeah.
And initially, I'll keep my fingers on that floating reamer holder just to help keep it aligned. It wouldn't hurt anything if you let go, but I think you get a better start by keeping it up and centered.
Yeah.
And
it gives you more information too.
Sure, because you can feel all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, so that first cut, I'll cut the rifling away and I'll cut maybe 100,000ths of the neck just to get a feel for the steel and see what it's looking like. I like to stop at that point and take a look and see how I'm aligned, see if the cut looks nice and if the throat is cutting fairly uniformly.
Yeah.
If it was way off to one side or something, I would stop and check my setup and try and figure out why.
Yes. It's better to find these problems early on so that you have time to deal with them.
Right.
Shallow angles on your body taper are an example where you don't have a lot of forgiveness, right?
That's a fact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or chatter, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing is looking for chatter. It's my experience that there's two things that really promote chatter. That's a pilot that's too small, so you've got the reamers allowed to float around in the bore and it's bouncing off the rifling as it's doing that.
Yep.
Which causes that torquing on the reamer, and of course the bouncing around will cause the opposing flute to make a cut every time it bounces to the other side.
Yep.
So,
right.
So you can end up with some pretty deep grooves if you're not careful.
Yeah.
But basically I'm just watching for that, feeling for it. Take a slow cut so that you can make sure it's smooth. And you do have to load the reamer enough so that it's actually cutting smoothly. If you try to go too soft, that's not going to work. You're going to get chatter, you're going to get wear on the reamer.
Just like parting on a lathe.
Right.
If you don't part with enough feed, sometimes you get breakage of tools, all sorts of problems. That's why I like to power part if I can.
Right, right.
It's a step of faith sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah, when those big chips are coming off, you're like, oh, I hope this works.
Yeah, exactly, especially on a lighter lathe, yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So and then the after that first cut, then I'm willing to cut a little more at a time. So I might, especially with something like a 300 Blackout where we're not removing very much, as long as there's enough relief in the flutes of the reamer so that the chips are flowing.
Yep.
I'll go a couple 100,000ths on those first maybe 2 or 3 passes after the initial start.
Yep.
And once I get up to the shoulder, then I usually slow down because at that point you're going to start to see a lot more chips flowing.
Oh yeah. You're taking a real cut then.
Right. And of course, the bigger the chamber, the more truth there is there.
Sure. Yep.
And even if I have board, that still happens. You can still see it happening. We just, at that point, just go whatever the reamer will allow. And it usually ends up being 40 or 50 thousandths in a pass. If you go much more than that, you'll pack the reamer, which can cause it to cut oversize. It can cut grooves. The chips can get packed in things and cause problems. So that's why you want to clear it frequently.
Yeah.
And of course, lots of cutting fluid every time.
Yep.
Like I say, I got a little bit overzealous and I went about 10 thousandths too far.
Right.
And that was just because the steel was cutting super nice and I wasn't super precise. I just said, okay, we've got about another 150 thousandths to go. I made a couple passes, and then the last one I only went 30 or 40.
Right.
But that turned out to be just enough.
And with that barrel nut, we have a lot more leeway, but you still have to be mindful of the end play, right?
Right.
You don't want so much
yeah.
that you have unsupported case.
And that's exactly the case too. The way I did it, we were too deep, so we would have had the back of the barrel touching the front of the bolt.
Right.
Don't want that.
No.
Yeah. So we corrected headspace, faced the back of the barrel off to do that. We cut a 42 degree bevel at the case mouth so that the ammo will feed in a little more smoothly.
Which is 3 better than a 45.
Absolutely.
A little bit more forgiving, right?
Right.
A little bit more feed funnel.
I just think it feeds a little smoother,
Yeah.
and really, if you look at designs over the years, a lot of stuff has that kind of an angle when it comes to feeding and stuff. So, so we got it all headspaced, got that bevel cut in there so it'll feed nice, and then we were ready to go ahead and put it on the action. So at that point, you just take it out of the headstock, clean the barrel, which I think we still have failed to do.
Right. Right. Yeah, we'll do that before we shoot it.
Yeah, absolutely, because I'm not into trying to squirt oil down the range.
Yep.
And the potential problems that would come with that.
Correct.
Yeah.
But I think before that, let's talk next about using tools other than a lathe to do a muzzle threading job.
Oh, okay.
So this was definitely something new for me. And again, this has been a scenario for me multiple times. Did not have the right bushings for the barrel vise, but powdered rosin to the rescue.
Fills up that space nicely.
Cake that baby up. Nice and thick. Once you tighten that down, it locks up amazingly tight. So we got that all locked on. We had the muzzle sticking out in the air.
Right.
Time to get down to business.
Right. So that's when we got out the annular cutter, which is this little goodie here. And it cuts on the end primarily, so there's nothing happening on the outside.
Right.
But basically the pilot, it keeps it aligned with the bore, and it takes a little bit of chip load. You saw that I had to put a little pressure to it to cause it to cut nice and clean. You got to keep the RPMs fairly low. It's a maximum of 250 RPMs. We used a variable drill, so if I had ran it at full speed, it would have burned up the tool.
Right. That pilot itself, you don't want that spinning very fast in the bore, and you need a lot of lube on that to keep it from scoring and all that.
Yeah, you don't want it to get galled up.
Right.
I mean, if it were to pick up a burr or a chip or something and weld that, it would probably tear a strip out of your rifling.
Right.
And so that's another reason to keep it going slow. The lube will keep that from happening if you're paying attention. It's all about using your brain, having some feel for things, understanding how the tool cuts.
Yeah.
You know. So when we lean into it a little bit, we get a chip load. You can see a nice clean chip coming off. And I noticed that this one, 2 flutes were doing most of the cutting. We were getting kind of a spiraling cut there.
I saw that.
Yeah, pretty cool.
So it's almost like you're on a lathe and you're taking one pass to go from 0.8 inches or whatever that was down to 0.625 or whatever that ends up at.
Right.
And multiple cutters at the same time. Yeah.
And that's the whole point. You know, this is a tool for somebody who doesn't have a lathe.
And they can rent this from 40 Rentals?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. Wasn't my idea, but I really like the setup, the adapter that was made for it and the pilot system.
Now, if they rent this, do they have to specify the pilot diameter, and then you just give them one pilot and then the annular cutter and they go to town?
Yeah, and the way it's set up on the website is pretty simple. They choose the diameter of the cutter that they want.
Yep.
And that gives you the number that it gives you is the finished diameter.
Sure, like half or 5/8.
Right.
Typically.
Right. So they order that, and then they can go down and just click on what pilot they want.
Gotcha.
And if they want multiple pilots, then that's always an option.
Cool.
So
awesome.
Yeah. So basically, we just went ahead and did that cut. We measured my adapter for my suppressor to see how long of a thread we wanted. We just marked it with a black marker and went to town.
So that was basically the mount, right? So it's as if you're screwing on a thread protector or a muzzle brake or whatever to check for fit.
Yep.
Yep.
So basically, the one thing we noticed when we cut was there was a little bit of a shelf left. And that was partly because I was busy talking to everybody while I was cutting. Because you do need to pay attention. You need to keep the cutter aligned nicely with the barrel. Another reason that you might get a little bit of an offset like that would be if the bore isn't completely concentric to the exterior of the barrel, and that is very common with pre-turned barrels.
And barrel quality has a huge influence, in my experience, on what the OD to bore runout ratio is. I mean, all over the place.
Right. So we decided to thread it a little further, ultimately, because we had a little bit of problem with the die not cutting quite right.
Right.
So we went back and extended our shoulder back a little more, and then went back with the die and cut again.
Yep.
The die uses a thread alignment tool. I just call them TAT for short. And that little thread alignment tool is pretty cool. You thread it into the die.
Yeah.
It fits the muzzle, also caliber specific.
Yep.
And one of the tricks to using those is you thread them into the die far enough so that it's not actually butting against the end of the barrel. It's actually just floating in the die so that you don't create a bind.
I really like that idea because it helps you get a square start on things.
Right.
You know?
Well, and when I started it, I don't know if you noticed, I put the pilot in and I just put my palm flat against the back of the die. And as I'm turning it, I'm just applying straight pressure. I'm not doing any side pressure whatsoever.
Right. Yep, I like that.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the annular cutters is, they weren't made for this purpose. It's something somebody went, oh, this industry has this, I'm bringing it in.
Right, right.
And so they might be off by 0.005. But that doesn't matter. If you keep the thread alignment tool there and everything, it will cut that little bit of extra material, no problem.
Nice.
Yeah. So, and I occasionally will get a question from somebody, I don't understand, this is 0.005 over, 0.010 over, so you have to have that conversation.
Sure. Yeah, and then we had a 10 in there that was too long.
Yeah, by the time we got done, we decided that we had room to cut it back a little bit and eliminate some material. So
Which the consideration was legality, right?
Right, I had to keep it over 16.
Yep, otherwise it's an SBR.
Right, and while I think those are fun, I don't have a tag for this one. So.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so so anyway, we checked our length, made sure we had plenty of room, and then recut it so that we had the exact tenon length we wanted.
Yep.
And we're pretty much right at minimum. It's 16 1/4. So it's I don't like to ever do them right down to the minimum.
Sure.
When I was in school, Dunlap's thing was do the country sheriff's rule. And the country sheriff's rule is actually 16 inches showing. Because the idea is the country sheriff is just going to grab his tape measure and he's going to look at what he can see.
You don't want to explain common barrel datum points to him on
you
the side of the road.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to explain. Look, the ATF does it this way.
Right, yeah.
So.
So we had a rough bandsaw mark there on the end, which gave us the opportunity to use some more tools, right?
Right, and I rent these, but these are the Brownells tools that are made to do muzzle facing. So there's a 90-degree facing cutter for simply getting a square in.
Yep, that'd be this guy.
Right,
yep.
And then there's an 11-degree crowning cutter, and then a 45. And so we used all three. The 90-degree we used to square up and get rid of the hacksaw marks.
Yep.
The 11-degree we did for a crown, and the 45 we went in by hand and just took the tip of the rifling off right at the crown.
Yeah.
And the value in that is because these are hand cutters, they might leave a little bit of a burr. So when you do the 45, you cut off the tip of the rifling and you remove the little burr at the bottom of the groove.
Yep.
And now you still have an 11-degree crown, but there's no danger of any burr being in the bore.
And when you're withdrawing your cleaning rod, the jag's not going to get hung up as bad. And
Right.
Yeah. That's nice. So at that point, the barrel work was done. Now's the moment of truth, right?
Right.
Headspace.
Yep. So we swapped the barrel around in the vise so that we could set that up. We just, because it's a nut system, we ran the nut all the way up against the shoulder and then checked to make sure we had bolt clearance when we get it into the right position. And as soon as we knew that we had that, then we went ahead and put the go gauge in the barrel and adjust the nut until we get it to where we can just feel it just snug, back it off about 1/8 of a turn, and then set up to tighten it. And we take the gauge out for a minute and the bolt out. Tighten the barrel up. We used a Remington style wrench because it works just fine, fits just fine, same diameter
Very
receiver.
handy that works on a Ruger American. Yeah.
Yeah, and we ran the screw into the receiver to keep everything from slipping, because there's nothing worse than getting all done with your project and leaving tracks on the outside of the...
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially if it's a customer's gun.
Explaining it to a customer, yeah.
If it's my own, that's one thing.
Sure, I have the same mentality. Yeah.
Right. So we just snugged it up, double-checked the headspace, make sure everything's working right, go, no go. I'm sure you guys have heard before, but a go gauge the bolt should close nice and smooth. It's okay if you can tell that it's on the gauge, but it shouldn't resist the gauge at all.
Exactly.
It should go all the way down. The bolt should close all the way, no problem. The no-go gauge, ideally, what you want is no sense that the bolt is going down.
Right.
Right? You start to close it, but it won't go.
Yeah.
And so the name is pretty self-explanatory.
Like
No
a
go.
hard stop. Yep.
Yeah, and this was perfect. It was exactly that.
Yeah.
There was no doubt that we had the proper setup.
So we know, since there's typically 4 thousandths difference between the go gauge and the go gauge, that we're within 4 thousandths of however the gauges are set up with respect to SAMI specifications.
Right, and of course SAMI sets standards for the industry for safety reasons, so that you can interchange ammo from different companies, you can interchange guns with ammo from different companies. And there's real reasons for those tolerances, and it's not something that's just random.
Right. Yep. And if you're a reloader, you know all about shoulder bump and all of the related issues with ammo from one gun to the next and all that. So with that, we are ready to put the gun together. So here's what I think we should do. Put the barreled action back on the stock, install the scope yet again. Let's take some ammo up to the 100-yard range and see how this does with 300 Blackout. This is going to be fun.
I'm excited. I have one in an AR, but I wanted to have one in a bolt, so this is going to be a lot of fun.
Same situation here, I just haven't built mine yet. Okay, so we're going to go shoot, and we'll tell you how it goes. So we set up to shoot at the 100-yard mid-mountain range. Recently made some range improvements. We've got underground power now. We've got things really dialed in and a nice roof over our heads, which was good because it was 102 degrees out.
Yeah, that little bit of baked heat was not near as bad as direct sun.
Yes, been there many a time. And what we thought we would do would be to test supersonic ammunition and subsonic ammunition. Both are interesting scenarios for the 300 Blackout.
Sure. You know, the ammo that I brought was 150 grain. And so we kind of doubted whether that would perform well because it's a 1 in 8 twist barrel. So it's kind of just logical that that's not going to be the greatest choice.
Right.
And that kind of proved out.
Yep. I found when I started shooting with the rifle with this lower power scope, so it's got a large dot in the middle, great for close quarters work. That combined with the really heavy trigger that is on the factory gun here, I was like, I don't know if I could do this.
Right.
So we buzzed it down to the shop and got this Athlon Midas tack. This is the 5 to 25 by 56. This is the newer one. I have some of those 6 to 24s that I've shown. That made a huge difference, I would say.
Oh, absolutely, because we could, on these 1-inch orange dots, we could still see center of the dot. And the other way, we were covering the orange dot and actually guessing just a little bit.
So that might be a great scope for some intended purposes, right?
Right. And my thought for the gun, it does fit because it's for game, small game probably at shorter ranges, possibly deer.
Yep.
But it's not intended to do fine work at a long distance.
Exactly. Right. Larger targets, etc. And to compare, so I have here the test target from 350 Legend, and this is actually a punched hole here in the top.
Right.
And that group, a 3-shot group, measured 1.352 inches. And from what I understand, you didn't spend a whole lot of time at the range. It was kind of like, let's just see where things are generally at before.
Well, and I think we shot 2 targets like that, and they were roughly the same.
Okay.
And frankly, I decided not to shoot lots and lots of rounds because all I was after was a pre-target to see what the gun did.
And what was the ammo?
This was, let's see, I'll have to send you that information. I don't have it.
Yeah, I'll include that in the article just for reference. I've shot a few different types of ammo, but all through an AR-15.
Right.
Right, and all of my 300 Blackout shooting has been through an AR-15, so good exercise.
Right. And I didn't like the way the Legend fed in the original gun. If I was going to keep it in that caliber, I would do some tweaking that's going to be needed done as well for the 300 Blackout.
Enlarge the ramp slightly.
Right, just to make it feed better. And I can imagine that choices of bullet and seating depth could have a big effect on that.
I'm saying ramp, but what I really mean is the bevel right at the entrance to the chamber.
Right. It ends up being almost an abutment, so we need to have that opened up a little wider probably and just a little deeper.
Yep, case mouth can catch up right there.
Right.
The tip of the bullet can need to hit the ramp.
Right.
Yeah.
And we talked about this before, and then we never got around to actually sectioning a case. But
Right.
If you're going to do that kind of work and you're worried about getting that bevel too large, you can section a case in half. Usually I do just the back half of the case so that I can use the front to keep it head spaced and everything.
Yep.
And then you can see how much of the solid head and the web of the case is being exposed.
Yep.
And that prevents you from overcutting and
Yeah.
having an unsupported case.
Exactly. Unsupported case is definitely the big issue. And when in doubt, be careful.
Right.
Yeah. So we had 2 different types of ammo. Some commercially reloaded 150 grain ammunition. And you picked that up at essentially like a swap meet or something, did you say?
No, I was actually at a fundraiser, and,
Okay.
and these guys were a fairly new supplier, and
Gotcha.
they came and donated for the fundraiser.
Gotcha.
And I got in a contest with somebody else and bought the ammo. So
Yep. And like you said, we were a little bit suspicious. 1 in 8 twist, probably optimized for a heavier bullet. And what's going to happen? And what happened was, wait for it, about 2-inch groups, which still is adequate, actually, for certain types of varminting at close distance, right? You got it.
I'd go to my dad's cabin and shoot rock chucks.
That's right.
You know,
Depending on how far away they are, right?
right? Yeah, keep them to 100 yards probably with that.
Yep. And this was actually after we switched scopes. The before, I believe, on this with the lower power scope was not quite that good or whatever.
Right.
And then we thought, okay, well, let's switch to the 220 grain. We have from Fog Ammo, there's Headwaters ammunition. This is 220 grain Sierra Match King. This is some pretty high-end ammo, really, really nice stuff. What is this going to do?
Right. And my expectation immediately was with the twist rate, we should get a better result.
Okay. Yep.
And I remember after I said that, I said I probably should not have jumped right out there because you never know. But
right. And this was the interesting thing about this. You know, before with these larger groups, we were both shooting with the Harris bipod and we were shooting with the Game Changer rear bag. And Fred continued to shoot with that configuration here. And we have a sub 3/4 MOA group, 0.757 inches and 0.723 MOA. And you can see that the group is very slightly taller than it is wide. So I thought, well, I saw a bit of bouncing with the bipod on the table, and I could see that by watching the end of the suppressor kind of bob up and down. And I thought, let's get out the bench rest. Now, this is not an optimal setup by any means because we've got a Sporter type 4 end here, which is very small in diameter. And I've found when you put that in a bench rest, all of a sudden things get really rocky and tippy, right? And the bipod actually helps with that. So my group was 0.728 inches. Thank you very much.
whatever.
30 thousandths of an inch. 30 smaller. A whole 30 smaller than yours. Thousandths of an inch.
That's like a stack of 6 sheets of paper, right?
0.695 MOA. And roughly a round group, I would say. If anything, probably more windage than elevation, which makes sense because we're now rocking side to side more than we are bouncing up and down with those rubber feet.
Right.
So I would say, mission accomplished.
Absolutely.
We got a better result. Now you've got a rifle that is really versatile. Supersonic, subsonic, all sorts of different things. And with loading, maybe you'll get half MOA results.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, you know, you have the same experience I do. The more things you try, more bullets, different powders, there's always something better out there. Or at least you have to believe it.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. This has been fun. It's been fun to see you work at the lathe. It's been fun to do a Ruger American, something that I've wanted to do for a long time here, and we did it together for the first time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the idea of building a gun that, price-wise, most guys can afford to build.
Yeah.
You know, this is a minor custom, I guess you'd say. You pick the barrel you want and the caliber you want, and maybe get something that is either not available currently or maybe the factory has never offered it.
Yep.
I'm aware that they do a 300 Blackout, but I doubt you could find one right now.
Yep.
So
It's true. It's a cool deal. So, follow up for you all. First, think about it right now. Think about what feedback you want to give us on this build. What would you do differently or the same? Would you choose a Savage Axis? Would you choose a Thompson Center compass for your low budget build? Tell us what you would do exactly. Also, if you want to rent any of these tools, 4drentals.com, and if you click on that first link in the video description, I'll have a link to the story we just filmed yesterday, which covers Fred's business, Fred's books, a bio, lots of entertaining stories to hear there, and the books are a great point of reference for a variety of topics. Thank you for watching. That concludes this video, and that means it's time to wrap it up. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up. Also, make your voice heard. If you have something to say, please drop a comment. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications because you're not going to want to miss the awesome content that is coming up. And finally, flex your reloading pride. You could look great in one of these t-shirts. We've got multiple designs at the Ultimate Reloader store. I'll see you later because I'm off to go shooting.